At the dinner for my 86th birthday, my drunk son toasted, "To the old lady who won't let go of Dad's inheritance." The next day, I updated my will, left $5 million to the gardener, and flew to Monaco. I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from, so I can see how far my story has reached. I never thought my 86th birthday would be the day I finally understood what it meant to have your heart broken by your own child. The dining room was perfectly set with my grandmother's china, the crystal glasses catching the light from the chandelier that had witnessed 60 years of family dinners. Everything looked exactly as it should for a celebration. Wesley arrived late as usual, stumbling through the front door with that loose-limbed swagger that meant he'd already been drinking. His wife Sandra followed behind him, her eyes immediately scanning the room like she was taking inventory. She always did that, mentally cataloging my possessions as if she was already planning where they'd go in her house. "Sorry we're late, Mother," Wesley said, not sounding sorry at all. His breath reeked of whiskey when he leaned down to give me a perfunctory kiss on the cheek. Traffic was murder. It was 3 p.m. There was no traffic. The other guests were already seated around the table, my neighbor Margaret, old family friends the Hendersons, and my book club ladies who had known me for decades. Nolan, my gardener, had helped serve the appetizers before quietly retreating to finish his work in the greenhouse. He'd been working for me for 15 years, and unlike my son, he never forgot a birthday or failed to ask how I was feeling. The dinner conversation started pleasantly enough. Margaret shared news about her grandchildren, and Mrs. Henderson told funny stories about her recent cruise. But I could feel Wesley growing restless, refilling his wine glass repeatedly, while Sandra made pointed comments about how spacious my house was and how valuable the artwork looked. When I stood to cut the birthday cake, Wesley suddenly pushed back his chair and raised his glass high in the air. The room fell silent as he swayed slightly, that cruel smile spreading across his face that I'd learned to dread over the years. "A toast," he announced loudly, his voice carrying that edge of meanness that alcohol always brought out in him. "To the old lady who won't release Dad's inheritance." The words hit me like a physical blow. I felt the blood drain from my face as the room erupted in uncomfortable murmurs. Margaret gasped audibly. The Hendersons exchanged horrified glances. My book club ladies looked like they wanted to disappear into their chairs. But Wesley wasn't finished. He took a long sip of wine and continued, his voice getting louder and more vicious. "Come on, Mother, we all know what this is about. You're sitting on millions while your only son struggles to make ends meet. When are you going to stop being so selfish?" Sandra giggled behind her hand. Actually giggled, as if this public humiliation of an 86-year-old woman was the funniest thing she'd ever witnessed. I stood there frozen, the birthday cake forgotten in my hands, feeling smaller and more insignificant than I had in years. This wasn't just about money. This was about being reduced to nothing more than a bank account in the eyes of the child I'd given everything to raise. "Wesley, that's enough," Margaret said sharply, but her voice seemed to come from very far away. "Is it, though?" Wesley continued, swirling his wine glass. "I mean, what's she saving it for? She's 86 years old. It's not like she's got decades of shopping ahead of her." The cruelty in his voice was breathtaking. I realized that to my son, I wasn't a person anymore. I wasn't his mother who had sat up with him through childhood fevers, who had worked 2 jobs to pay for his college, who had always put his needs before my own. I was just an obstacle standing between him and what he considered rightfully his. I set the cake down with trembling hands and excused myself to the kitchen, my face burning with shame and humiliation. Through the window, I could see Nolan in the garden, carefully tending to the roses my late husband had planted 40 years ago. He looked up and waved, his kind face creased with concern when he saw my expression. That simple gesture of genuine care from someone who owed me nothing made me realize something profound. In that moment, standing in my own kitchen while my son publicly berated me in front of our friends, I understood that the person who treated me with the most respect and dignity wasn't my flesh and blood at all. It was the quiet man who remembered that I preferred tea to coffee and always made sure the bird feeders were full because he knew how much I enjoyed watching the cardinals from my breakfast nook window. When I returned to the dining room, most of the guests were preparing to leave, their faces etched with embarrassment and pity. Wesley had helped himself to another bottle of wine and was now slumped in his chair, completely oblivious to the destruction he'd caused. As I watched my friends file out, offering hurried apologies and sympathetic hugs, I felt something shift inside me. The hurt was still there, sharp and deep, but underneath it was growing something else, something harder and more determined. Wesley had made his position clear. Now it was time for me to make mine. That night, I sat in my late husband Robert's study, surrounded by photo albums and memories, trying to understand how I'd raised such a heartless man. The house felt different after Wesley's outburst, tainted somehow, as if his words had poisoned the very air. I pulled out the album from Wesley's childhood, hoping to find some trace of the sweet boy I remembered. There he was at age 5, gap-toothed and grinning after losing his first tooth. At 8, proudly holding up a participation trophy from Little League. At 12, rolling his eyes at the camera but still hugging me tight on Mother's Day. When had that changed? When had my son learned to see me as nothing more than a source of money? The answer came flooding back in painful waves. It started when Robert died 15 years ago. Wesley was 38 then, already struggling with his third failed business venture. Instead of offering comfort during my grief, he immediately wanted to discuss Robert's life insurance payout and when I planned to distribute the assets. I remembered being so shocked by his callousness that I couldn't speak for several minutes. My husband was barely cold in the ground, and my son was already calculating how much richer his death had made him. But I made excuses. Grief affects people differently, I told myself. He's just worried about financial security. He'll come around. He never did. Over the years, Wesley's visits became increasingly transactional. He'd show up with Sandra in tow, both of them making a show of concern for my health, while dropping hints about renovations they couldn't afford, or investment opportunities that required just a little help from family. When I'd write the checks, Wesley would hug me and call me the best mother in the world. When I hesitated, or suggested he find other solutions, he'd turn cold and distant. I thought about the times I'd said no, like when he wanted me to co-sign for that ridiculously expensive house in the suburbs, the one that was clearly beyond his means, or when Sandra insisted they needed money for fertility treatments, despite having no stable income to support a child. Each refusal was met with accusations that I was selfish, that I didn't care about his happiness, that I was clinging to money I'd never be able to spend. The manipulation was so gradual, so constant, that I'd almost started believing it myself. Then I thought about Nolan. He'd started working for me not long after Robert's death, when maintaining the large garden became too much for me to handle alone. I hired him to cut the grass and trim the hedges, expecting him to be like the other contractors who came and went, efficient but impersonal. But Nolan was different. He noticed things. When I mentioned that the birds seemed fewer in number, he researched native plants that would attract them and asked permission to add them to the garden. When I slipped on the front steps during an ice storm, he spent his own money to install better lighting and anti-slip strips. He never asked for anything beyond his agreed-upon wages. Not once in 15 years had he requested an advance or hinted that he needed financial help. Instead, he brought me vegetables from his own garden, remembered that I preferred yellow roses over red ones, and always knocked on the door to check if I needed anything before he left each day. Last winter, when I'd been sick with the flu for a week, Nolan had shown up every morning to shovel my walkway and bring groceries. When I tried to pay him extra for the kindness, he'd refused, saying that neighbors help neighbors and I was far too good to him already. Wesley, meanwhile, hadn't even returned my calls during that illness. When he finally visited 2 weeks later, his first comment was about how thin I looked and whether I'd updated my will recently. The contrast was devastating. My own son treated me like a burden to be endured until I died and left him rich. A man I paid to tend my garden treated me like I mattered as a human being. I remembered something Robert used to say during the difficult times when Wesley was younger and constantly in trouble. Character isn't what people do when they need something from you, Doreen. It's what they do when they have nothing to gain. By that measure, Wesley had shown his character clearly over the past 15 years. And so had Nolan. I closed the photo album and walked to the window overlooking the garden. Even in the darkness, I could see the shapes of the plants Nolan had so carefully arranged. The butterfly garden he'd created near the back fence. The herb spirals he'd built so I could easily reach the basil and rosemary I loved to cook with. The memorial rose bush he'd planted for Robert without me even asking. This was more than just yard work. This was love expressed through action, through attention to detail, through quietly making my life better without expecting recognition or reward. Tomorrow I would call my lawyer, but tonight, I allowed myself to grieve, not just for the relationship I'd lost with Wesley, but for the illusion I'd been clinging to that blood automatically meant loyalty. Some people earned their place in your heart. Others simply assumed they deserved it because of an accident of birth. It was time I learned the difference. The law office of Morrison and Associates had been handling my family's affairs for over 30 years. James Morrison Jr. had taken over from his father, and he knew our history well enough to understand that this wasn't a routine appointment when I called that Tuesday morning. "Mrs. Patterson," he said. He, settling behind his mahogany desk with my file spread before him. "What can I do for you today?" I sat straighter in the leather chair, my hands folded in my lap. "I want to change my will completely." James raised an eyebrow but said nothing, waiting for me to continue. He'd learned long ago that elderly clients often needed time to find their words for difficult decisions. "I want to leave everything to Nolan Reeves, my gardener." The silence stretched between us. James cleared his throat carefully. "Mrs. Patterson, that's certainly your right, but this is a significant change from your current will. May I ask what's prompted this decision?" I told him about the birthday dinner, about Wesley's toast, about 15 years of watching my son treat me like nothing more than an inconvenience standing between him and wealth he felt entitled to. James listened without interrupting, occasionally making notes on his legal pad. "I need you to understand something," I said when I finished. "This isn't a rash decision made in anger. This is me finally acknowledging what I should have seen years ago. My son doesn't love me. He tolerates me because he expects to inherit my money. Nolan treats me with genuine respect and kindness, expecting nothing in return." James nodded slowly. "I have to ask, Mrs. Patterson, are you certain about the amount involved? Your estate is worth approximately $5 million. "I know exactly what it's worth," I replied firmly. "Every penny of it." We spent the next 2 hours going through the details. I left Wesley a token amount, $10,000 and Robert's watch. Not out of spite, but because completely disinheriting him would give him grounds to contest the will. This way, it was clear I hadn't forgotten him. I'd made a deliberate choice about his worth to me. The rest, the house, the investments, the savings, everything Robert and I had built together, would go to Nolan. A man who had never asked me for anything but had given me 15 years of genuine care and respect. James prepared the documents with his usual thoroughness, ensuring everything was legally sound. As I signed each page, I felt a weight lifting from my shoulders that I hadn't even realized I'd been carrying. That evening, as I was preparing dinner, the phone rang. I almost didn't answer. Wesley had been calling repeatedly since the birthday disaster, leaving increasingly angry voicemails about how I'd embarrassed him in front of my friends. But this time, I picked up. "Mother, we need to talk." His voice was tight, controlled in a way that meant he was furious but trying to hide it. "Hello, Wesley. I'm coming over. Sandra and I need to discuss what happened the other night." Something in his tone made my stomach clench. "I'd rather you didn't. This isn't a request, Mother. We'll be there in 20 minutes. The line went dead. I stood holding the phone, my heart racing. Wesley had never spoken to me with such barely contained aggression before. Part of me wanted to call James Morrison and ask him to be present, but I knew that would only escalate things. Instead, I called Nolan. "Mrs. Patterson, is everything all right?" His voice was immediately concerned. "I wonder if you could come by this evening, perhaps around 7? I'm expecting some difficult company, and I'd feel better having a friend nearby." "Of course, I'll be right there." He arrived 15 minutes later, just as Wesley's BMW pulled into the driveway. Through the window, I watched my son get out of the car, his movements sharp and angry. Sandra followed, her face set in hard lines. When I opened the door, Wesley pushed past me without a greeting. His eyes immediately found Nolan, who was quietly arranging flowers in a vase on the side table. "What's he doing here?" Wesley demanded. "Nolan is a friend," I said calmly. "He's welcome in my home." Wesley's face flushed red. "Send him away. This is family business." "No." The single word hung in the air like a challenge. Wesley stared at me as if I'd grown a second head. In 38 years, I'd never refused him so directly, so simply. Sandra stepped forward, her voice syrupy sweet but her eyes cold. "Doreen, honey, we're just concerned about you. The other night was so unlike you, getting upset over a little joke." "A joke?" I repeated quietly. "Wesley was just being playful," she continued. "You know how men get when they've had a few drinks. He didn't mean anything by it." I looked at my son, who was staring at me with an expression I'd never seen before. Not embarrassment or remorse, but calculation. He was trying to figure out how to manipulate this situation to his advantage. "Actually," Wesley said, his voice becoming smooth and reasonable, "I think we should discuss your mental state, Mother. Getting this upset over harmless family teasing, refusing to see us alone, having the hired help present during family discussions. These could be signs of declining cognitive function." The threat was barely veiled. If I didn't fall in line, he'd try to have me declared incompetent. But instead of the fear he expected, I felt something else entirely. Relief. Wesley had finally shown me exactly who he was, dropping all pretense of filial affection. There was no going back from this moment, no more wondering if I was being unfair or too harsh in my judgment. My son had just threatened to have me declared mentally incompetent for refusing to be bullied in my own home. "I think you should leave now," I said quietly. "We're not finished talking," Wesley snapped. "Yes," I said, meeting his angry gaze with steady calm. "We are." 3 days later, Wesley discovered what I'd done. I was having my morning tea when the front door slammed open so hard it rattled the windows. I didn't even look up from my newspaper as my son stormed into the kitchen, his face purple with rage. "You crazy old witch! What have you done?" I took a careful sip of my Earl Grey. "Good morning, Wesley. I wasn't expecting you." "Don't play games with me." He slammed a crumpled paper onto the table. It was a copy of my new will, which meant he'd somehow gotten someone at the law office to betray client confidentiality. $5 million to the gardener? Have you completely lost your mind? "My mind is perfectly clear," I said calmly. "Clearer than it's been in years." Wesley began pacing like a caged animal, his hands clenched into fists. "This is insane. I'm your son. That money belongs to me. Actually, it belongs to me. And I can leave it to whoever I choose." "You can't do this." His voice cracked with desperation. "I've been counting on that inheritance. Sandra and I have plans. We've made commitments based on my death?" I interrupted quietly. "How morbid of you." He stopped pacing and stared at me, breathing hard. For a moment, I thought he might actually strike me. Then Sandra appeared in the doorway, having followed him into my house uninvited. "Doreen," she said, her voice dripping false concern. "You're clearly not thinking straight. This kind of erratic behavior, these sudden changes, they're signs of dementia. We should get you to a doctor." I laughed, actually laughed, at the transparency of their manipulation. "I'm 86 years old, not stupid. I know exactly what you're trying to do." Wesley leaned forward, planting his hands on the table, his face inches from mine. "You're going to change that will back, or I swear to God." "Or what?" I asked, still infuriatingly calm. "You'll have me declared incompetent? You'll contest the will? Go ahead and try." The silence that followed was deafening. Wesley straightened slowly, his expression shifting from rage to something colder and more calculating. "We'll see about that," he said finally. "Come on, Sandra, we're done here." After they left, I sat in my kitchen for a long time, my hands shaking slightly as the adrenaline wore off. But underneath the natural fear any elderly person would feel when threatened by someone younger and stronger, there was something else, something I hadn't felt in decades: freedom. That afternoon, I called my travel agent. Within hours, I had a first-class ticket to Monaco, departing the next evening. I'd always dreamed of seeing the Mediterranean, of walking through the gardens of Monte Carlo, of sitting at a sidewalk cafe watching the world go by. Robert and I had planned to go for our 40th anniversary, but he'd died 6 months before we could make the trip. It was time to stop waiting for life to begin. I spent the rest of the day making arrangements. I asked Margaret to check on the house periodically and gave her Nolan's number in case of emergencies. I called the bank to ensure my credit cards would work internationally and arranged for wire transfers if needed. I packed carefully, comfortable shoes for walking, light dresses for the Mediterranean climate, and the pearl necklace Robert had given me for our 25th anniversary. The hardest part was saying goodbye to Nolan. When I told him about the will, he was stunned into silence. "Mrs. Patterson, I can't accept that," he said finally, his voice thick with emotion. "It's too much. I'm just your gardener." "You're not just anything," I replied firmly. "You're the kindest, most decent person I know. You've treated me with respect and genuine affection for 15 years. You've earned every penny." He was quiet for a long moment, staring at his work-roughened hands. "What about Wesley?" "What about him?" "He's your son. Blood is blood." I thought about that for a moment, watching Nolan's face. Even now, even knowing how Wesley had treated me, this good man was trying to protect my relationship with my son. "Blood doesn't make someone family," I said finally. "Love does. Respect does. The way you treat people when you have nothing to gain from them, that's what makes someone family." At the airport the next evening, I felt lighter than I had in years. As the plane lifted off, carrying me away from a lifetime of disappointed expectations and one-sided sacrifices, I pressed my face to the window and watched the lights of the city shrink below. For the first time in 86 years, I was going somewhere for no reason except that I wanted to. My phone had been buzzing with calls from Wesley all day, but I'd turned it off before boarding. Whatever threats or manipulations he was planning would have to wait. I had more important things to do, like learning what it felt like to live for myself. The flight attendant brought me champagne, and I raised the glass in a silent toast. To Robert, who would have loved this adventure. To Nolan, who had shown me what real kindness looked like. And to myself, for finally finding the courage to choose dignity over family obligation. As the plane flew through the night toward a new continent and a new chapter of my life, I smiled and closed my eyes. Tomorrow, I would wake up in Monaco, and for the first time in decades, no one would be able to tell me what I owed them or how I should spend my money. The old lady who wouldn't release the inheritance had finally released herself. Monaco exceeded every dream I'd ever had. My hotel suite overlooked the harbor where pristine yachts bobbed gently in the azure water. The morning air carried the scent of jasmine and sea salt, and I spent my first week simply walking. Walking through the botanical gardens, along the palace walls, through narrow streets where centuries-old buildings housed charming cafes and boutiques. For the first time in my adult life, I had no schedule, no obligations, no one depending on me for anything. I read books on my balcony, tried foods I'd never heard of, and struck up conversations with fellow travelers who knew nothing about my family drama and didn't care about my money. It was blissful. Until Wesley found me. I was having lunch at a cafe near the marina when I saw him striding across the square, his face set in grim determination. Sandra wasn't with him this time, which somehow made his presence more ominous. He'd tracked me across an ocean, spent money he probably didn't have on international travel, all because he couldn't accept that his meal ticket had finally stood up to him. He slammed into the chair across from me without invitation, his expensive suit wrinkled from travel, his eyes red-rimmed with exhaustion and fury. "This ends now, Mother." I continued eating my salad niçoise, not looking up. "Hello, Wesley. How was your flight?" "Cut the act. You're coming home with me today." "No, I'm not." He leaned forward, lowering his voice to a dangerous whisper. "I've already filed papers to have you declared mentally incompetent. Dr. Harrison is willing to testify that your recent behavior shows clear signs of cognitive decline." I finally looked up, meeting his desperate gaze with calm detachment. Dr. Harrison was Sandra's uncle, a semi-retired psychiatrist who'd never treated me but would say anything for family. "On what grounds?" I asked mildly. "Giving away millions to a stranger, abandoning your family without explanation, erratic behavior, emotional outbursts. You mean refusing to let you steal from me?" His mask slipped completely then, revealing the raw desperation underneath. "That money should have been mine years ago. Dad left it to you temporarily, to take care of you until you died. It was never supposed to be permanent. There it was. The truth Wesley had been too careful to say out loud before. In his mind, I'd been dead since Robert passed away. I was just an inconvenient delay in his inheritance timeline. Your father left everything to me because he trusted my judgment, I said quietly. He knew I'd be wise with our life's work. Apparently, he was right. Wesley's hands were shaking now. Whether from rage or desperation, I couldn't tell. I'm not leaving here without you. Yes, you are. A new voice interrupted us. I turned to see a Monaco police officer standing beside our table, his expression professionally neutral but alert. Madam Patterson, this gentleman is disturbing you? I smiled at the officer, whose name was Claude and who had been incredibly helpful when I'd registered with the local authorities as a temporary resident. I'd mentioned that I was concerned about unwanted family contact, and he'd given me his card. Officer Mercier, thank you for coming so quickly. This is my son, who seems to believe he can force me to return to America against my will. Claude turned to Wesley, whose face had gone pale. Monsieur, do you have a passport and visa allowing you to be in Monaco? Of course I do, but... Are you attempting to coerce this lady into leaving the country? Wesley's mouth opened and closed like a fish. He clearly hadn't expected to deal with international law enforcement. This is a family matter, he said finally. A private dispute. In Monaco, harassment is not private, Claude replied smoothly. You will leave this lady alone, or you will be detained. I watched Wesley's face cycle through a dozen emotions before settling on defeated fury. He knew he was trapped. His threats meant nothing here. His connections were worthless, and his attempted manipulation was about to land him in a foreign jail. He stood up slowly, his hands clenched into fists. This isn't over. Yes, I said, returning to my salad. It is. After Wesley left, Claude sat down at my table and ordered coffee. Your son, he said thoughtfully. He seemed very angry about money. He spent his whole life expecting to inherit mine. Now he won't. Claude nodded, as if this explained everything. In my experience, money reveals who people truly are. It does not change them. It simply removes their masks. That evening, I called Nolan from my hotel room. He answered on the second ring, his familiar voice instantly comforting across the thousands of miles. Mrs. Patterson, how are you? How's Monaco? It's wonderful, Nolan. But I have some news. Wesley was here today. I told him about the confrontation, about Wesley's threats and his obvious desperation. Nolan listened quietly, occasionally making soft sounds of disapproval. I'm worried about you being so far away, he said finally. What if he tries something else? He can't hurt me here, I assured him. But Nolan, I need you to know something. I've arranged for you to receive the first installment of your inheritance immediately. $500,000 will be transferred to an account in your name tomorrow. The silence stretched so long I thought the connection had been lost. Mrs. Patterson, he said finally, his voice thick with emotion. I don't know what to say. Say you'll use it wisely. Say you'll do something good with it. I promise you, I will. I've been thinking about something since you told me about the will. My father is in assisted living, and the care isn't what it should be. There are so many elderly people there who never get visitors, who've been forgotten by their families. With this money, I could make their lives better. I could create something that honors what your husband built, what you've taught me about treating people with dignity. I closed my eyes, feeling a peace I hadn't known in years. This was why Nolan deserved everything, not because he was perfect, but because his first instinct was to use unexpected wealth to help others. Wesley would have bought a bigger house and complained it wasn't enough. That sounds perfect, I whispered. Robert would have loved that idea. The next morning, I woke to find a dozen voicemails from Wesley, each one more unhinged than the last. He'd discovered the money transfer and was threatening everything from lawsuits to showing up at the hotel with security. I deleted them all without listening to the end and turned off my phone. Some bridges needed to be burned completely. 6 months later, I was sitting in a cafe in Nice, reading a letter that made me cry tears of joy. The envelope had arrived at my new permanent address, a charming apartment overlooking the Mediterranean that I'd purchased after falling in love with the French Riviera. The letter was from the Sunshine Manor Assisted Living Center, signed by 12 residents whose names I didn't recognize, but whose words touched my heart deeply. "Dear Mrs. Patterson," it began, "we wanted to thank you for the gift you gave us through Mr. Nolan Reeves. He used your generous donation to completely transform our home. We now have a beautiful garden where we can sit and read, a library filled with large print books, and most importantly, staff who have time to actually care for us properly." The letter went on to describe movie nights, art classes, and field trips that were now possible because of the increased funding. But what moved me most was a single line near the end. "Mr. Reeves told us that this was possible because a very wise lady understood that some people earn their place in your heart, while others simply assume they deserve it." I folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the envelope, smiling through my tears. Robert would have been so proud. My phone buzzed with a text from Margaret back home. "Wesley's house went into foreclosure last week. He and Sandra have moved in with her parents. Thought you should know." I stared at the message for a long time, waiting to feel something. Guilt? Sadness? Regret? But all I felt was a distant kind of pity. Wesley had gambled everything on an inheritance that was never guaranteed, living beyond his means while assuming his mother's money would eventually solve all his problems. Now he was learning what it meant to depend on the kindness of others, something I'd never had the luxury of taking for granted. Another text came through, this one from Nolan. "Mrs. Patterson, I hope you're well. The garden center expansion is almost complete. We're hiring 3 new employees, all formerly homeless veterans who need a fresh start. The residents love having purpose again, helping with the plants. Thank you for making this possible." I typed back quickly. "The thanks go to you, dear friend. You saw the gift and made it into something beautiful." His response came immediately. "I learned from the best." That afternoon, I took my usual walk along the Promenade des Anglais, watching couples stroll hand in hand and families laugh together on the beach. A year ago, watching such scenes would have made me achingly lonely, reminding me of what I didn't have with my own family. Now they simply made me happy. Not everyone's family looked the same. Some were born into love, others found it in unexpected places. I'd been fortunate enough to experience both, the deep, abiding love I'd shared with Robert, and the chosen family I'd discovered in Nolan's quiet kindness. My phone rang as I was settling onto a bench to watch the sunset. Wesley's name appeared on the screen, the first time he'd called since Monaco. After a moment's hesitation, I answered. "Hello, Wesley." His voice was different, smaller somehow, stripped of its usual arrogance. "Mother, I wanted to apologize." I said nothing, waiting. "I've had time to think, and I realize I was wrong. About everything. The way I treated you, the things I said. I was angry and scared and I took it out on you. And now you're broke," I said quietly. A long pause. "Yes, and you're hoping I'll feel sorry for you and send money." Another pause, longer this time. "I was hoping maybe we could start over, be a real family again." I watched a seagull land on the railing beside me, its bright eyes alert and unafraid. "Wesley, we were never a real family. We were a woman who loved too much, and a man who took advantage of that love for 43 years. That's not fair," he said, but there was no conviction in it. Fair would have been having a son who called to check on me when I was sick. Fair would have been having a child who treated me with respect instead of seeing me as an obstacle to wealth. Fair would have been raising someone who loved me for myself, not for what I could give him. I could hear him breathing on the other end, could almost picture him in whatever reduced circumstances he now found himself in. "The money's gone, Wesley. All of it. And even if it wasn't, I wouldn't give you another penny. Not because I'm cruel, but because some lessons can only be learned the hard way. So that's it? You're just going to abandon your only child?" The question hung in the air between us, heavy with implication. But I wasn't the one who had abandoned anything. "I'm going to live the rest of my life in peace," I said simply, something I should have done years ago. I hung up before he could respond and turned off my phone. The sun was setting now, painting the Mediterranean in shades of gold and orange that took my breath away. In a few hours, I would have dinner at my favorite restaurant, where the waiters knew my name and always saved me the table with the best view. Tomorrow, I was meeting a group of expatriate women for a wine tasting in the hills above Cannes. Next week, Nolan was coming to visit for the first time, bringing photos of the assisted living center and updates about the garden that was now providing fresh vegetables for both the residents and a local food bank. I had built a new life from the ashes of my old one, surrounded by people who valued me for who I was, rather than what I could provide. The money that Wesley had coveted so desperately was being used to create joy and dignity for people who had been forgotten by their own families. As the last light faded from the sky, I smiled and headed home to my little apartment, where fresh flowers waited in a vase and a good book lay open on my reading chair. I had finally learned the difference between being alone and being lonely, and in learning that difference, I had found something more precious than any inheritance: the knowledge that I was worthy of respect, kindness, and love. At 86 years old, I had discovered that it's never too late to choose yourself, and some choices once made bring a peace that no amount of money can buy. Now I'm curious about you who listened to my story. What would you do if you were in my place? Have you ever been through something similar? Comment below. And meanwhile, I'm leaving on the final screen 2 other stories that are channel favorites, and they will definitely surprise you. Thank you for watching until here.